And every company is a tech company now, right? So I think every GRC function should be tech GRC and automation. Are you considering the output? Have a pre-discussion with the auditor, explain to them, and or maybe even teach them how to understand the new format of evidence, how to maybe even trust that evidence by giving them a preview of how the system was built, how that's immutable, how that's not edited. Few solid conversations that I would have had with engineers in the platform org in my time to where some of them would have come to me and said, you've written a roadmap for my networking team or my platform team through what you're saying.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the GRC Engineering Podcast, Season 2. I have an amazing guest with me, Akhila Chitiprolu. She is currently working at Sierra as the head of GRC there. She has a very fulfilled career in GRC. She worked for a long time at Stripe, managing, I think she was head of technology GRC. She also worked at Expedia, at T-Mobile. She's been in the industry for probably over 10 years, close to 15 years. So she has a varied experience, especially around the SaaS and tech space. And she also oversees some GRC engineering initiatives, which is why I wanted to invite her on the podcast today. Very nice to have you on. How are you doing?
Thank you, Ayoub, for that introduction. And I'm excited to be here and dive into GRC engineering with you. As you know, I'm very passionate about this space, so looking forward to it. A little bit of my background too, just adding to that, is that exactly what you said, and coming from an engineering background and education and applying some of those to the GRC space. Fundamentally, I started with going to University of Washington, had some really amazing professors who kind of gave me the intro into data protection, why do we care about customer data and privacy, and just how to build systems securely and responsibly, which till today seems very relevant. And combining that with my experience as an engineer first and being able to work with really smart world-class engineers has helped me build this space into what it is today, and excited to be here.
Very cool. Wow, you already dived into like your history and stuff. That was very interesting. Okay, so you started as an engineer, which is always nice. I think often people that come more from like an engineering background, when they see the more traditional GRC, I think often they look at it like, no, we need to stop this. We need to change this. So I think it's always good to have like this outsider perspective because often it's refreshing. Also, sometimes you're like, hey, if you knew, this is very easy to solve. Let me show you. And we need a lot of that. So if you dig a little deeper in like your journey in GRC, like the different roles you've had and how you've grown to being head of GRC now, what has been your experience and like along the step, like how the kind of engineering mindset also like kind of directed your path?
For sure, for sure. I worked across different industries, tech, telecom, fintech, and AI, increasingly also very regulated industries where both customers and regulators are equally intent on the company, the organization doing right by the customers, right by the data. So I would say I started off and seen very traditional GRC through spreadsheets, where sometimes controls are wish lists than something that's living and breathing, to getting more visibility into what GRC is more horizontally across the company, and to semi-automation, automation, and then eventually driving through some of the GRC engineering space more recently. And it's been very humbling to watch that evolution happen. And every company is a tech company now, right? So I think every GRC function should be tech GRC.
Nice. That's yeah, you're preaching to the choir. I really like this. What would you say in like your experience? What was one or maybe two examples of where you like this has to change? Like the way we do X is like, it's just the worst. We could do it so much better. Would you have one or two examples from your career that you can you can talk to us about?
Yeah, for sure. I have Sarah lived through the experience of traditional GRC and what folks might call it audit burden, audit fatigue of evidence collection, or just being able to translate a compliance framework, an audit framework to engineers or drive the importance of it and get them to really help build that, help us get compliant, help us get secure. Um, Increasingly, I would say evidence collection is probably like the key front-facing experience that we would see from an engineer, and especially as you think about larger companies and regulated industries, it's no longer just SOC 2 or ISO, right? There's 10, 20, even 50 that I've seen in a company that's subject to regulations, whether that's industry oriented or regional or just security, privacy, now responsible AI. It's important to understand where the pain points are first, and I would say evidence collection. But then even beyond before that is the if your controls are designed to not scale, to not automate, then evidence collection will continue to be painful. So even if we did solve for evidence collection, I think that particular process, even if technically engineered, will continue to be a challenge. So some of my examples, like you were asking, I would say is that evidence collection, going to maybe 30 different teams and asking for evidence of from a host that every engineering team might have owned to the control itself is designed for a traditional, maybe on-prem system, but for a cloud or for an AI company, it's different. So some of those I would say are starting points of uh, where engineering and GRC engineering should thrive.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's like the lowest hanging fruit a little bit. I think it's like because you win on both ends, so it's easier for you, but also it's easier for control owners. Because often for them it's toil. It's like, sometimes they see the meetings and like, why am I sharing my screen and show this? Just like I could just like send you this JSON and we're done. What would you need this? And I think it's good to see as like kind of a baseline. Because I think often it's the first win that really gets you started, and then you want to do like even more, like more complex, like access control and all the other things. But I think evidence collection is a good point. In your career, like when is the first time you encountered or you practiced maybe yourself GRC engineering? Like what was the tipping point in your career on that front?
The tipping point for when GRC engineering was a thing. I think it was when a bunch of dots were connected looking back and it came about to be GRC engineering. Um, I would say building and understanding like where the engineers are coming from and how that system is built was foundational for me to even understand why someone is saying system hardening is important or access management is important. So instead of kind of coming in from the outside in like an external auditor in some ways, um, didn't seem to scale, and we as folks building that GRC function would need to understand a bit more about that systems thinking, and that's probably what I would say is key. um, yeah, the engineering part, I would say, is if there is observability and automated evidence and the design is in code, the control design is embedded into code, that's what GRC engineering is. And maybe over the last few years, thanks to you and the GRC manifesto that you have built, it put everything into place, I would say, of this is why it is required. Well, we'll talk a lot more about like what and how, but I think the why is completely justified and I think sufficiently aware, like folks in the practice, in the community are sufficiently aware of the why right now.
Yeah. I think now it's like more like common knowledge. I think that these things are important. We should change the approach, like spreadsheets and like questionnaires if we talk about TPRM and like spreadsheets and stuff. I think it's more common compared to maybe even 3 years ago, 2 years ago. I think there's a change. But like something you said about like what you viewed at your company and how like everything kind of fit together. I think often working in a smaller company sometimes helps get you closer to that quicker. Because I think in bigger companies, a lot of like GRC staff are like kind of ex Big Four, typical IT audits. But in smaller companies, when they do the first hire, you work in a very engineering driven company. So they don't really take the BS too much. So when you come on with these things, they have a bit more pushback. Like you need the certification, but at the same time, especially pre-automation companies, I think when you need to work with them, like you need to really be ready to like work in Jira and like understand like pull requests and everything, because if not, like there's no like there's no second option. Like you can't go like to an Archer or like a typical tool and just get information out of there. It's like there's nothing.
Yes, totally. You said it right. It's actually very, maybe a little bit more difficult to scale and build GRC engineering in a large traditional companies because it's not just, yes, we stood it up, but how do we drive adoption? How do we bake it into process? How do we shift that mindset, shift that culture into the a world of possibility and innovation? So in that sense, I would say yes, it's somewhat easier, but then also pushing engineer to not just take GRC at face value and having them push GRC folks and say, it doesn't have to be so painful. Like, tell me how it could be better. Let's partner together in how we can innovate together, I think is a starting ignite point for a GRC engineering function to spark in a company.
I really like that point. Yeah, I really like that point. I think often like if you can build those good relationships, I think they actually like that you're kind of more driven towards that approach. So most likely they'll lend you a hand, maybe they'll build some stuff with you, or at least they'll make it so it's easier for you to get that information out, just because like you make their job easier, and you also understand like the mismatch between how it's asked in the framework and how it actually lives in reality. And because like I remember once I was working for a small startup and they thought one control was dumb. I just say it makes no sense. Like it was, I think, related to endpoint security. And the developers, they were pushing back at all times. They don't want to do it. And then I was like, I also think it's dumb, but we need to do it because we need to sell. And then they looked at me and they were like, oh, so you also think it's dumb? I was like, yes. I'm like, okay, so then we'll do it.
That's right. And then, it's for GRC engineering, it's a step beyond that. You and the engineer might understand totally why that's important. But in GRC, it's a lot of the outside in perspective where it's not one auditor or two auditors. Sometimes it's up to 50 or more auditors and regulators and the mindsets they come with in the frameworks that they have built, whether that's PCI or SOX or ISO, for example. And getting a buy-in from all those auditors, and every 3 years when you change an auditor or something, it just adds to that challenge. You might say, I will pick the best fit auditor, and sometimes it's not all, all that straightforward. So you continue to have that outside in challenge of you might have great alignment internally, but how do you continue to share that perspective, bring that auditor on board, get them to trust the evidence, a spreadsheet or a screenshot, and move beyond. A PR can be code and it doesn't have to be a screenshot. That kind of education, I would say, is also critical, along with just applying engineering in GRC internally. And that's a challenge that we all have to now go address.
Yeah, that's a great point. We'll come back to that because yeah, I want to ask a question about that because that's a very, very good point. So what I wanted to hear from you is like in terms of how like what problems so we've spoke about evidence collection. What problems do you think GRC engineering is solving and in your experience solved for you throughout your roles?
To answer that, maybe we'll take a step back and think of like what is GRC, right? And fundamentally, when we're talking about GRC, perhaps we can focus on compliance engineering, which again is the many audits and the many frameworks and regulations, sometimes with a legal intent, sometimes with a fintech or a healthcare intent, or a EU or a APAC intent, right? So there's all of these intents that we'll have to start off with from a GRC standpoint, and then build on top of that, I would say. And for that, uh, think of what GRC processes include, whether that's understanding the from an applicability of the audit to scoping to building, designing and building the controls, and then to evidence collection, and then the auditor acceptance. So there's almost like 4 or 5, and depending on the company, or and maybe even 6 phases. Where does GRC engineering fit in all of that? Maybe the answer is all of them, but it's hard to sell everything all the time at the same time, right? The front facing to engineers in terms of burden or pain points is typically evidence collection. So maybe that's where the first focus of GRC engineering perhaps is. But through that, if there's an opportunity to change the control design to inform the scoping and applicability, I think that's also other places where GRC engineering can come to life. So yes, I would say GRC engineering should be eventually have a goal to apply across all the phases. Leverage AI for scoping and applicability, or leverage engineering mindsets for design, and then implement that for observability and automation.
Yes, that's a good point. The fact that you kind of broke it into phases, I think often like the end phase, kind of where we're more involved with control owners, is around evidence collection. I think, even something like scoping, I think often um, we artificially kind of narrow the scope because of manual evidence collection, but also because we don't want to have too many potential observation issues and qualifications. So we artificially reduce the scope. But then if you have more of an engineering driven approach, maybe you can expand the scope, because if you automate the control testing, then you can have a bigger scope. But potentially more things could go wrong as well. So there's like also a way like where GRC engineering could kind of butt with like the business side of things, because maybe you need something fairly narrow, so you have zero qualifications, zero non-conformities in ISO, like none of that. But at the same time, if we think more like security for its own sake kind of approach, then you would want to have the production scope from the infrastructure team or the development team that matches the one in compliance, but it's very rarely the case. So yeah,
That's right.
that's
Being in GRC, and I've seen GRC for an early company to maybe in different orgs, depending on who needs that first. I've heard and seen of companies where GRC is in a sales team because they had to unblock sales, or immediately so at least. And then in maybe legal, or it's typically security, right, for the most part. And I'm seeing more and more tech orgs adopt where GRC is in a platform org, which is again building that secure platform, secure foundations, which is where most GRC baseline controls are built is. And I've seen uh, personal success in enabling that for a GRC and GRC engineering function.
That's very cool. Yeah, on the platform side, I think some pushback from people would be, but not all controls are technical. Okay, there's also organizational controls and like, human related controls, which makes sense. But I think often these controls, I think the complexity of implementation and like the refinement you need is fairly low often. And also often they don't map to outcomes for the other teams. So we would check for security awareness, but except for the governance team or our team, like no one cares about security awareness. Whereas if we speak about encryption, you care about encryption, but security engineering also cares about it a ton. So there's an alignment of incentives, whereas often like some of the policy related controls, like who cares about the acceptable use policy? Like people, they need to follow it, but it's not like it's something that they think about every day. Whereas in a lot of technical controls, like you can have a very good alignment with infrastructure, with application security, which means then like when you spoke about the platform side, then you can be directly embedded with them. So from the design, you can ensure like your needs are met instead of like being bolted on later on the collection side, but you were not involved with the design on the technical side. You had a test of design on the like control testing, but actually how it was implemented in practice, you were not involved. So I think getting involved in these conversations is like, it's probably very rare. I think it's like the end, like it's like the best teams world class would have that in place, which is pretty impressive. So we've talked about a lot of ways through which GRC engineering can have an impact. Like, would you say what's the like? I want to get started, okay, and I want to kind of build a case for GRC engineering. So we talk about a lot of potential outcomes. You also spoke about all the different phases in like especially compliance. What would you say is the one you could use to sell it to either GRC leadership if they're a bit adversarial, maybe they're not used to it, they come from traditional backgrounds, or like security leadership as well? Would it be evidence collection, or could you maybe approach it more in like systemic way?
Right. Evidence collection can definitely be a good start. If this is taking an example of an already established company that may have gone through a handful of audit cycles or something like that, there is history that you can work with on which were the most painful phases of an audit of a compliance framework, and kind of do a deep insight and root cause analysis of where the problems were and be real about what the problems are. Sometimes they're not even engineering problems, they're fundamentally understanding of the system or a scoping challenge also. So yeah, lay out all of that in terms of problem space, and then lean towards ask those curious questions and tough questions of where was the problem to begin with and how can we solve for it. And for the company, those things I think are very fundamental. Sometimes it's hard to pause and look back, but even going through that process, running say an audit retro at the end of a cycle or at end of every phase, it clearly gives those data points. How many hours did an engineer spend to take 50 screenshots is a very like baseline example, and then it quickly multiplies for the number of audits you have, number of teams you have to go to, things like that. So I would say as long as like that metric is something that we've repeatedly said audit over audit, cycle over cycle, the we kind of aggregating data points to help make that case. And it doesn't always have to directly result in establish a GRC engineering function. You start small. The GRC compliance person manager might extend their role or partner with an enthusiastic like a product security or a TL or something like that, and then make small wins and show progress. And that's I think one way to at least kickstart the function.
I like it. Okay, so that's a good approach, and I think like the audit retro, yeah, you said about, I think is very smart. I'm not sure most teams would do that. I think they would go through the audit cycle, kind of manage the issues and observations that came out of it, but I'm not sure you do a retro and like how much it costs all of the control owners in terms of like amount of time spent and also disruption, right? Because we do that, but you don't do something else. And sometimes you prep, so you have walkthroughs before and then you have walkthroughs during the audit, so sometimes it's like you have it twice as well. So potentially if you automate and they can trust the source, then you could win like double the time. So that's a really good approach. I think it relates very well into like money, like business terms, because like each hour would be worth, especially for engineers, potentially a lot of money. And I think compounded by the number of people involved in the process on the control owner side, like it could lead to like tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. So I think the value add can be clear on that front. What would you say, like you spoke mostly about like time saved and like on that front, what would you say? Would you say, for example, on like the reporting side or the visibility, would you say it's also an area where you could also showcase like the benefits of having more engineering approach? Let's say just engineering is not like, it's just like kickstarting a movement internally.
Um, yeah, beyond evidence collection and beyond like hours saved, I would say the observability part is important, where you can say every year, every audit cycle, you may have a preview in a sample of hosts that, or a sample of systems that may have worked okay, but you almost may not have observability, continuous monitoring into across all the systems, across all your tech stack and all your assets. So that's one way to say, um, if you had that observability, maybe you fixed gaps ahead of time, ahead of the audit, or in that month, in that week. So that's another way to say we've gone ahead and proactively are able to now fix this. So it's not all hands on deck during an audit period or during a evidence collection phase. That's one proactive measure, I would say. The other one would be the asset to control relationship, which can get also very difficult. Some of the GRC platforms kind of have both those modules, but not necessarily in a way that you pick an S3 bucket or an AWS, or you pick an access management system or a version control system. But what controls apply to each of your asset and asset type is not very visible. But if you are able to say, hey, system owner, I have, you own X systems, and this is the control, like compliance posture, security posture for each of your system or a collection of your systems. That's something a good story to have on how behind or how well we are doing with respect to monitoring. And then it ties to assets. And then asset ownership is almost fundamental to scoping and who do you go to for fixes and just remediation, right? So I would say the asset controls, the proactive like observability, how much did you solve for ahead of time? We're not no longer kind of doing the whack-a-mole GRC of every each control is kind of passing for the audit, but how about like the full picture of the control, the end-to-end of that business process, that critical process the control is built for. I think those are some of the additional ways beyond number of hours saved to monitor for.
Yeah, no, that's some very good points. I think what stuff is like when you're a smaller company, the sell is probably tougher because there's this focus on like compliance as a business enabler. Whereas in bigger companies, I think that's where you, as you said, like you go there probably like you kind of pitch it to leadership after maybe a cycle or two. They've already been through compliance once or twice. So then it's already a given. You already need it anyway. So that's where you can actually make that headway, because making things better in terms of compliance closer to actual security, I think it makes more sense when the company kind of understands the pain, but they also understand like the power of compliance, because you have this baseline set of controls and you can embed them in your environment, and you can, if you can track them properly, then you pass certifications almost as like positive externality, like it's just happened, right? Because we prepped for it, but we could be prepped for an audit that can happen at any point during the year. We don't need to specifically prep for it. So that would be
Make it
like,
predictable. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. Because like ISO would be point in time, but SOC 2 like they test throughout the period. So potentially, if you try to whack-a-mole at the last minute, potentially it would still be visible that, you didn't do it. But dude, there's always ways to massage these things, but there's this most likely that you have something come up if you prepped everything 2 weeks before, or something like that. So that's a very good point. So we're speaking about audits. I'll go back to what you said about a bit earlier. Like when you have a more engineering approach, the type of evidence you provide is different, because you work with control owners to get that in different a format that is probably like more machine readable, that looks more like JSON, YAML, stuff like this. How, like in your experience or like your understanding, like how do I choose an auditor that is ready for this? Do I train my auditor to understand it more? Like what ways do I transform the data so they can actually get it in like maybe a spreadsheet or something so they can do VLOOKUPs? Like what are some of the strategies you could use to like make sure your audit firm is more on board and you can actually leverage what you've built to actually make the audit faster and more efficient?
Right. That's a good question. A lot of auditors and the kind of frameworks and mindsets that they come with are just built over the years. So I do say that it's easier to work with some tech forward auditors versus other more traditional auditors. So I would definitely say pick the auditors that's right for your company, for your culture, for the kind of GRC processes and evidence that you may have, and interview that auditor in how you're selecting them and if they are a right fit beyond their like experience and certifications, right? So that would be step one. Step two is, as you're considering automation, are you considering the output? Have a pre-discussion with the auditor, explain to them, and or maybe even teach them how to understand the new format of evidence, how to uh, maybe even trust that evidence by giving them a preview of how the system was built, how that's immutable, how that's not edited, how they can trust that piece of evidence, and then give them also some ways to mentally map the traditional evidence to that new form of evidence. Yes, it has a timestamp. Yes, it has an author. Yes, it's tied to that particular system. Um, and then beyond that, I would say once you have that like pre-understanding of this is how evidence is going to look, and it will not be screenshots, it will be something different. Uh, will have to go through that audit. I wouldn't say it was, in my experience, has been so smooth or straightforward across all audits. Some auditors are traditionally just technical and have been system engineers or just engineers in the past, and they get it. And I've been lucky to have worked with some of such auditors, which kind of gives you that boost to, yes, this can work. And if it worked with one and then have five, it can work with 10 and 50 different auditors. So that's definitely something to as a last step to consider.
Okay, that's very good. So I'll actually summarize your point because they all three were very good. So you said audit the auditor, right? Kind of first step, kind of understand what they know about it, how they think about it, like are they potentially a good fit for the way you approach evidence collection? You said like showcase how they can trust the system because we also often see that, right? Because I don't know why, but they trust the screenshot more than some of the other things. So they need to trust where the information is coming from and is it trustworthy? And I think on this at some point, hopefully, you know, like if the evidence is pulling from like cloud infrastructure, let's say AWS, like if the other understand how the information is pulled once, hopefully for all audits for any other company, they also understand that you can still trust that system because it's the way it's designed, it's like predictable, it's always the same output and like all these things. So that I like that. And the last point you said is like kind of how they can map it to traditional evidence. So I really like it. Hey, of course, it's not timestamps like metadata, but you still have the specific time and like to the nth degree of like second and milliseconds. So you have all of that. So I think it's actually a very good like kind of recipe to get started when you want to move towards this and you're kind of wary of like, is the auditor going to be on board? And I think some firms have been pushed by especially by the automation industry to think about evidence gathering a different way. I think also like firms were just like more to understand that the industry is moving, and to make sure they're still relevant and they also can keep some of those like bigger customers, kind of working that way is a way to ensure you're fit for the future because in 10 years most likely, hopefully, that's what we're planning for. Screenshot will be a thing of the past and most likely that's just plug into systems and you get the information. So I really like it. That was very good points. One hotly debated topic in GRC engineering circles and stuff is build versus buy. So it's something that people spoke often about. Everyone has very strong takes. To kind of summarize the takes, build is like, okay, you can get whatever you need, but maintenance is tough. It takes a lot of human hours to kind of do all the connections, and you can't have like feature richness of like commercial off the shelf. And then tools you buy once. I would say you just don't buy it because you have to integrate it on board. There's a lot of work, but at the same time, there's like one ticket price, and then you can kind of get started and have all these things baked in. Um, Especially you worked at like fairly big corporations that had like very mature programs. Like in your experience, and now you're working at smaller kind of scale up in the AI space. You worked in like kind of both sides of the coin. Like how do you see this build versus buy?
I have seen all kinds of GRC functions and programs that were set up, spreadsheet GRC to traditional GRC tooling to build your own GRC tools to automation platforms that are up and coming right now. For a large company, I would imagine they already have some traditional ways in place, and maybe that some of the traditional like GRC tools in place already. Um, they're nearly not enough to get integrations built in, automate evidence collection, get that observability. So a lot of it has to be um, integration into some other homegrown systems to that GRC tool, but then more importantly to those source systems, right? So I would say start off with a build and buy approach for a large company. It can't be one or the other, and no tool is, in my mind, perfect. And every tool needs to be handled responsibly by folks like us. And is the scope correct? Are we doing the right integrations in the right places at the right time? Do we know what new systems and tech stack is growing, right? So um, I would say a fundamental, like a vendor tool, is probably still helpful to put everything together because the vendors have thought deeply about what that tool needs and what teams like us require. But baking in like a bunch of other services and systems is also critical. But for that, you need a GRC engineering function to make that happen. For smaller companies, though, the fastest way to get that observability into either the lift or how horizontal and broad and even deep it is at GRC as a function is one way to be able to fast track all of that, to say, hey, all of this is going on, and yet there may be shadow systems, yet there may be areas that cannot be integrated into the newer vendor tooling. So there's still innovation required, there's still product thinking required, there is still due diligence from you and me in handling those tools. And some of it, if it's a vendor, you can start by outsourcing, and there's enough data on education and documentation on how to manage, but you can learn to that process. And as your company is growing, hopefully those tools will support startups, but also enterprises in the future. But there's a lot of catch up to do in that space to truly support an enterprise. But yeah, depending on how fast the vendor can move to support enterprise may also be a definitive factor. But even with Eddie, like the best kind of vendor, I would say there's internal engineering work that needs to be done. Whether that's a stretch goal for a control owner, somehow their responsibility, or your security engineer is really helpful and understands compliance, a dedicated GRC engineering function must probably be a thing for many large companies.
Yeah, okay. So I like the way you can explain it. So for smaller companies, like, build is like probably a bit of a stress. Like, buy is a good baseline, and then you can build on top of it. I think for bigger companies, as you explained accurately, like there's also this thing of you have so many custom systems, and of course, like a big selling point for automation vendors is like all the out of the box integrations you get. So it's so easy to plug into all these systems, but like often, like even the tech companies, the most like forward ones, they have a lot of kind of hybrid cloud, private clouds, on-prem systems, some stuff that is legacy from where the company started and now is like kind of crown jewel. We can't really change it, but if like anything happens to it, everything breaks. But you have to account for it. And I think that's where, as you said, even if you have a traditional vendor, which is more like a glorified database with a UI, kind of the typical like legacy vendors, I think you need a lot of tweaking and making it work for you. So in both cases, you need some build. How would you say, like, if I'm very small GRC team, potentially understaffed, no like engineering kind of savvy people in my team, like how would you build those relationships to get some engineering time from other teams? Like, how would be a good way to like kind of build those bridges so you can get some help on like connecting some stuff or like some quick wins where you can't do it by yourself?
Right. I would say as GRC engineering is evolving in the industry, the first step for a lot of traditional GRC analysts, GRC like compliance managers, is to be tech forward and have that product mindset and meet where the engineers are at in terms of maybe we are all GRC product managers. We are also evolving, right? So having that is already a win for the ability to talk to an engineer, productize GRC somewhere. And there's so much education out there that we could pick up and learn. I would also put it into perspective for the IT team, for the security team, for the platform team that we might work with on this is the now problem. Today, maybe we're subjected to audits. Tomorrow, it'll be 20. I can scale this with your help, and as a system owner, as an asset owner, here are your like I guess control owner responsibilities. But working together can help solve for this, scale for this in more meaningful way versus continuing to kind of live through that more painful process. The buy-in is sometimes dependent on culture too. Are you in a regulated industry? Is there top-down support? Do folks understand the importance of compliance being an enabler? So there's a little bit of the education and partnership, as well as sharing like that engineering mindset and partnership with engineers.
Okay, now that's a good approach. I like the way you phrase it. I think, as you said, like if like the way you said, like there's all the control owner like responsibilities they have, right? And now there's one audit, potentially there's like 10, 15, 20 coming down the line. I think if you frame it that way, like you said, like at some point we need to scale, so you need to make sure, we if you could help us scale. I think sometimes if we frame it so we understand their pain and we actually really get it, and we're not trying to say like you need to help us because compliance is important, but like we don't care about how difficult it is for you to help us, I think then it's more likely they might lend a hand, because sometimes what feels impossible for us might feel extremely straightforward for them. There's also this thing of like sometimes because of the imbalance of technical acumen, like something that feels sometimes completely out of reach for us, like for someone that is very seasoned in kind of scripting and stuff like this, in reality for them it's like, hey, it's a 15-minute job, maybe not 15 minutes, but it's like fairly simple. I work with some like very seasoned engineers, and sometimes I'm like, the brain is working differently. Like some of the stuff that seems like very complex with lots of different parts, like for them it's like boom, 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 done.
Yeah, yeah. And also then educating them on why that's fundamentally important beyond just passing an audit. There were quite few solid conversations that I would have had with engineers in the platform org in my time to where some of them would have come to me and said, "You've written a roadmap for my networking team or my platform team through what you're saying, because these are fundamentals. Yes, we want to support our customers and enable like new features and such, but I can only make my platform reliable, secure, resilient, have that availability uptime if some of the fundamentals are there, so that the platform is not throttled with just building new features and supporting new infra." um, I think that was a very enlightening like moment for me, where an engineer leader would come to me and say, "This is a roadmap that I want for my team." It's very humbling, but then also that the engineer wants to do right, and they see the ways of doing it right, enabling hardening and benchmarking for their systems. So. Uh, there is interest. We just need to find the right way to approach that engineer.
I like it. Hey, you should put it on LinkedIn, right? You helped like build the roadmap for like the network security team. Like that's something you should have as an accolade. That's very cool. I think it's like, being able to like influence the way some of the other teams like design their plan and like what things they want to implement, I think is like a massive win. Like that's literally what we all strive for in terms of actually impacting like pushing the envelope and really impacting security. That's very cool. Wow, that's I haven't done that yet, so that's I'm like, that's an amazing achievement. So you spoke about that actually, led into like the next question. It's more about like kind of how you scale. So let's say you've built the baseline, maybe you use automation vendor, maybe you're already more like traditional GRC plus some custom solutions for your own tech stack. How what are some of the kind of more maybe high level concepts I need to think about when I want to go from like maybe some basic evidence collection maybe to continuous control monitoring and getting like more and more refined in the way I design my GRC engineering program?
What are some fundamental principles? Is
Yes,
what is
that
the-
I need to think about.
um that's a very heavy loaded question.
You can make it
I'll
like
just
less
I'll break
heavy,
it down.
right? Yeah.
I would say um still start small, still do those quick wins, establish those patterns, repeat, I guess, on why that's been working in pockets of functions across the company, but how that can add up to be something that's um, more exponential if we were to add everything and put everything together, is one way I would approach it from a approach and mindset standpoint. The second one is still the people. It's the awareness that those fundamentals of security being a shared responsibility. It's not just a byline. It's something that we will have to live through in practice. So establish roles and personas of, as a product manager, security is you're responsible for that because we want to deliver some secure, responsible products to our customers. For a platform, it's for operational resiliency and reliability. For a sales engineer, it's you want to speak to our customers with authenticity, with an understanding of what we are speaking about from that security angle too, because every fundamental product right now is quickly going to become AI, and we have to talk about security, privacy, and now responsible AI and what that means. So there is still the fundamental like security awareness, compliance awareness parts that we need to work with. that's more from like an approach and process standpoint, right? From a engineering standpoint, that's where like maybe the metrics come in and the wins come in on we started small. This, there is this potential of for one audit, if we saved X hours, maybe for more audits, we save more hours. If it is for one product or one feature, it's the problem is X, but maybe with 5 features that we're shipping this year, it'll be that much more. So really also understand the business and the objectives, and get that attention from where the company is going and what the company priorities are, and maybe dip into those to say we've applied GRC engineering, so we were able to scale our like product shipping to be secure and has gone through that review so much faster. So again, there's no like one answer that fits every company, but depending on like where you are in that company's growth and where that's going, I would say dip into that, lean into that. So it's really going back to fundamentals and applying what GRC folks would have traditionally done along with engineering. So combining both like the tech aspects and the approach aspects together is how I would do it.
It's like the engineering part like enables the traditional like GRC objectives to be like, faster, more accurate, like more observable. So it's like GRC on steroids, right? It's like making it even more efficient, even more relevant. So
Yeah.
that's
And
yeah,
yeah, and really that's just the step one, because GRC engineering will still be very outside in. For security engineering, it will be we've already set up patterns of vulnerabilities, incidents, threats, and all these components that we would either measure and improve over time. And if your leadership understands it and if your CISO understands it, it's already a win. But for GRC engineering, there is a buy-in internally, but then a buy-in externally. That's almost depending on how many auditors you have to work with. So it doesn't end there. So I would say it's more continuous, and it can sometimes be we might sometimes be caught off guard, and that's like the unexpected, like unknown way. That's still something GRC space has to contend with, and that maybe that's where we make the functions beyond just a GRC engineering to onboard into this space, not just internal teams but also external auditors.
that makes sense. You frame it like there's a lot of challenges, which I completely agree. I completely agree. I do think that, you need to convince and kind of prove the value to so many different stakeholders, both internal and external. And it's very tough to push the program forward if you get one or two of those stakeholders to not be on board, because often it can break down quickly. So that's why like I like the quick win approach and making sure each stakeholder sees the value. So you kind of do all the due diligence with the auditors. You can explain to engineering the wins, also to the GRC leadership. So you make sure you get all of those like good relationship going, and you can keep all of them in a good stage at any point. Because if one of them breaks down, then the program quickly also can break down, because you need to juggle a lot of things all at once.
Yeah, rubber meets the road only when the external auditor blesses our evidence and signs off that report, right? So
Yeah,
and
exactly.
that needs to happen 50 times a year for a large company. So there's lots
Wow,
to
50 times.
contend.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. Yeah, I know that it can be a lot of audits per year for sure. A question I had, which is probably going to be my last question for you, is on the relationship between like GRC engineering and like more the engineering and the kind of regular GRC staff. So typical kind of conduit of we've seen in terms of career track to GRC. Would you say like is there some challenges in terms of like those collaborations? Do you think we should upskill GRC staff into engineering, or should we like kind of train software engineers or more like engineer driven people into like GRC knowledge? And would you say like there's some issues in terms of collaborating and understand requirements, and like I say something, did you actually get what I said?
Yeah, there is upskilling to be had in both sides, right? Both from a GRC manager, compliance manager to the GRC engineer, so that there's new ways of working together. A GRC analyst, for example, can no longer approach an engineer with a control by control approach or a framework requirement by requirement approach. They have to really synthesize, understand what access management means, or what config management means, or what change management is, and synthesize that into like top areas that are worth being engineered for, and then work with the engineer. If you approach it through more tactical, step by step, control by control basis, it's much harder to build engineering in through that process. So almost build that product roadmap for them, or build it with them, right? As both are learning how creating patterns on how to work together. So there's a lot of upskilling in that tech forward, that product mindset that I was referring to. Talk with the product managers in your company, talk with the TPMs in your company. They have fundamentally kind of reinvented how non-engineer interacts with an engineer, right? So leverage that learning. What does product adoption mean? What is driving a roadmap or embedding some requirements for an engineering roadmap, and what that means? So there's definitely that part of the equation. But even for the GRC engineer, yes, if someone comes from an engineering background, I think that's the easiest and fastest way to have a GRC engineer in your team. But then it can also be some of those engineers who have come from highly regulated industries or have built highly regulated systems, even FedRAMP or other like very strict kind of build. So they understand, have that mindset already. Or just start like pitching your ideas to an engineer that is probably just curious, or that you enjoy working with, or because they were subject to a lot of evidence, and say, help your future self, or come here, like help this, maybe go back if you don't want to do it, but help your team, So it could be a rotation, it could be a short-term stint, some external like stretch project for them. But really good GRC engineers, I would say, are very horizontal, are very curious, understand how the business works, and then approach problems. They wouldn't jump into building. They wouldn't jump into like do over engineering of a problem. They ask tough questions of that GRC analyst of, why does this really solve the problem? Like, is this the only way to solve the problem? So stress test each other, like push each other forward to do get to the right like outcome that's scalable, that's more approachable in the long term. Um, but if the failure mode would be, you create a lot of different features called GRC engineering, they fail to talk to the source systems, they're not compatible, and then if that person leaves, there is really no adoption there. So don't become that single point of failure is, I think, one caution like for that GRC engineer. But again, it's as we build that function, make it visible, make it so adoptable that you wouldn't think of taking away like your incident response system in that same way. Build that GRC engineering team and function to be a lot more horizontal, and used that the importance is just driven not just by you, the GRC engineer, but by folks across the company.
Very, very good answer. I really like the fact that you said like product managers can define the way you work with non-engineer. A non-engineer will work with engineers. That's a very, 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 very pertinent point. And I think everything you said about like kind of fact checking one another and kind of helping each other understand, like in my experience as well, often like engineers, they think in like front end, back end databases, like queue messaging. They have all these concepts, right? Like system design concepts. And often when we come with a problem, we come with like spreadsheets and like, our ways of thinking. And often if we explain the problem kind of almost abstractly, like this is the problem in a vacuum, like completely outside of like the current tool stack, often they come up with a solution that is amazing, but we couldn't think about because we don't think in those system design terms. And I think it's good because then it helps like the GRC person to understand problems in a different way. So then later they don't like get into too deep of like over engineering the solution to the wrong problem, right? Because maybe if we built it in a completely different way, maybe instead of like stitching so many CSVs together, maybe you could just use a relation database. So there's all this new concept. So that was a lot of good points in that segment. Really, really appreciate that. So I have my actual last question that I ask all my guests. My question is the following: if you had a magic wand and you could solve one problem in GRC, what could it be and why?
For me, like internally, selfishly, it's that asset to control view that I would want all vendors to solve for. It's a great way, it's a great pivot for me to talk about here is where we are at with our tech stack, and here are the number of controls like each system should work with. And I know that's like a very tactical, but very, very pivotal for us all to get that observability. Um, but the broader aspect is let's teach the community. I think we've taught the community a lot about why GRC engineering is important, but let's teach them like what that outcome is in terms of setting up pathways, setting up those tracks. For scoping, this is how GRC engineering looks like. For design, this is how it looks like. For implementation guidance, this is how it looks like. And then for evidence collection, I think we owe that to the community from a we want GRC engineering to happen, but a lot of like like early grads and newcomers into this field may struggle with where do I start? How do I start? And what is it that I need to start? Are we solving for SOC 2? Are we solving for PCI? Are we solving for every regulation under the sun? We have to start somewhere. Maybe help them start that from a GRC engineering standpoint. So that's, I guess, uh, my, I guess, reverse like wish list for the community.
Okay, that's a very good point. So I said I like the asset control, but like what you said as well about like kind of giving them practical solutions, more on like how good looks like. Of course it varies by environment, by company, but I think it's almost like the concept of what good looks like. In you said in design and like in scoping, how to think about this, like almost a checklist of everything you need to think about if you want to have more of an just engineering approach to scoping, to design. That's a really good point. That's something I also take on board. Probably something we should speak more about as well, because in our own programs we're trying to do this, but then often then it's like kind of sharing that back with like the broader community. Maybe you should come back for another episode and kind of discuss that with me. That'd be interesting as well, especially because we didn't speak about it because the podcast will last 3 hours, but you work at a big AI company, one of the, I would say one of the bigger ones, growing very quickly. So I also wanted to take on like how you think about GRC in the context of AI and how you think of AI in the context of GRC. So how it impacts also your work you do and helps, etc. But most likely that's a good reason for you to come back next time. So I really enjoyed the conversation. I think it was very thorough, and I think you had like very practical insights. Really feel that a lot of this stuff like you've been through, you kind of thought through all of this. So I really think that people that want to get started, build, and also get through those next steps, I think they can get a lot of out of our conversation. So thanks a lot for joining me for this talk, and yeah, I hope you had a good time.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was very nice diving into all things GRC engineering with another passionate member in the community.
Thanks for your time. Take care.
Thank you, Ayu. Bye.